My name's Jean Lambert. I'm London's Green Party member of the European Parliament.
So, what does Brexit mean to you personally?
I think Brexit is a horrendous mistake. I think that it means personally, there are so many people that I know, that I work with, whose lives have been thrown into absolute chaos by all of this, that I think as well what it's doing for the role of the UK in the world is diminishing our role. And a lot of the big sort of claims that were made by the Leave campaign are simply not realistic and never were. And they were never really challenged on it. So for me personally, the end of free movement is something that I'm really sad about. It's thrown people's lives into chaos, and what do we get out of it? Less than we had before.
So what does Theresa May's Chequers plan mean to you, and do you think it's workable?
Well, at least the Chequers plan is a plan. So it's very nice to have one after all this time, because one of the things that people have been really frustrated about has been that there has been no clear sense of direction for so many things. So you can't even negotiate things that, whether it's issues around healthcare provision, cross-border social security, all of that, because you haven't had a clear sense of direction. I think it's difficult to work, that it's not really paying attention to the issues around Northern Ireland as it should, and that this idea that somehow you can carve a very neat line between regulations on goods, regulations on provisions of services, I think in today's world, today's labour market, today's businesses is, it's theoretical more than practical. And of course, again, what it's doing in terms of free movement, I think is a retrograde step, because I think free movement is a really good thing in so many ways. So I think there are lots of very big problems in it, but at least it was an effort to put something on the table, which in my view we should have had before we even invoked Article 50.
I've heard it said that the Chequers deal is essentially asking for a Norway deal, but with the obligations of a Canada deal. Will the EU even accept or even look at the Chequers deal seriously?
I think there are certain parts of it that it will rule out and say, look, this can't work. You're saying that you want to be aligned on so many things, and yet, you're not going to accept DCJ judgments. You will give them due accord. So, the role of the European Court of Justice is not clear within this. And that in terms of what are the obligations and the I suppose the comeback if the UK doesn't fulfil its obligations are not clear. So I think that, it will be very difficult for the European Union to accept this as it is, frankly. But then it's also difficult for the Conservative Party to accept it as it is. So this is not just the EU being difficult,
In your opinion, can Article 50 be revoked?
I think Article 50 technically can be revoked. Politically, I think that's much more difficult, much though I would love to see it happen. That obviously, if it's a formal request made by the UK government that the EU 27 feel is being made in good faith and not just to, as it were, mess with the negotiations for the UK's advantage. If they feel it's being made in good faith, if, for example, there's increasing calls within Parliament in the UK for it to be revoked, if that's a formal decision of the Parliament, then I think the EU would be open to that.
Is Brexit not just a preamble to selling Britain off to American conglomerates, scrapping food safety standards, environmental standards, importing chlorinated chicken and burnt goat heads from Australia? Does this worry you?
It worries me a lot when I look at what the possible trade implications are for the UK within free trade agreements. I've worked in the European Parliament quite a lot on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. And one of the big things that was very clear in there was that a lot of the forces behind it were coming from the food and agriculture side in the United States, that think that a lot of the restrictions that the European Union has on whether it's chlorinated chicken, whether it's beef fed on growth hormones or whatever, are objections to genetically modified organisms. All of that is, the EU not being open, and that's something that they've wanted to try and undermine. So when you look at what those forces are likely to be if we're looking at a free trade agreement with the States, I think that this opens up huge questions for our agriculture sector, for what sort of standards we want to have there and how those standards will then match if we want to continue trading with the European Union. I think it runs a risk of undermining a lot of the food safety regulations that we have, and that in terms of the National Health Service, I think one of the things that's been telling there is that the UK government has not been willing to remove the National Health Service from free trade agreements. It's taken out the ambulance service, but it won't take out a whole lot of other stuff. So, and then they'll tell you, well, oh no, it will be safe. Well, a lot of us have said if it's going to be safe, put it in the legislation. UK government hasn't done that. So I am really worried, and I'm also really worried that the UK Parliament is not taking a strong enough role in setting the terms of future trade agreements.
The Good Friday Agreement is a peace treaty that's registered with the UN. Would Brexit mean by default the UK is breaking an international treaty? And if so, what are the implications?
I think that in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, whether Brexit breaks the terms of it, I think will depend as to what the outcome actually is of any particular negotiations. And this is why for the European Union, for many of us for the European Parliament, this question about the Good Friday Agreement is so crucial, because it's UN, because if we're going to have something which puts back a border not only for goods but a border for people, then I think this really does call into terms the structure, the outcome of the Good Friday Agreement and its future. And it's really worrying as well to hear some of those on the Leave side saying, oh well, we need to revisit the Good Friday Agreement, as if it just needs a little bit of tweaking. And that I think is really worrying. And I think if we're looking at good faith for the people on the island of Ireland, we need to be protecting that Good Friday Agreement. And Brexit throws it into question, quite frankly.
Do you think Northern Ireland was completely neglected in the conversation in 2016 and before that?
I think part of the reason that Northern Ireland was so neglected in the run-up to the referendum was partly because you had assurances, for example, from the then Northern Ireland Secretary saying it will not be a problem, we can sort all this, and also because it wasn't part of the conversation for the media. It was almost as if, oh well, we can fix this, and after all it's only Northern Ireland. And yet, if you're looking at the United Kingdom, I think one of the things that Brexit is doing is actually threatening that, and we may end up in a situation where we become effectively Little England, rather than out in the world, rather than the United Kingdom as part of the European Union.